Dad had packed what he called his hunter starter pack: 2 Snickers bars, a gallon of water, a half gallon of milk, 2 protein bars, and a handful of Slim Jims. He wore full camo, topped off with those yellow sunglasses he ordered off late-night TV. I didn't have anything close to his setup, so I threw on some of Jason's old clothes: a camouflage tee, some scuffed-up hiking boots, and a pair of beige khakis. Out of habit, I texted him to make sure it was all right to borrow his stuff. Halfway through the message, I remembered Jason wouldn't be answering. I slipped my phone back in my pocket and followed Dad out. We climbed into his pickup and started driving. I had no clue where we were going. Dad just said it was close. The sky was beginning to fade from black to a bruised purple and red. I never understood why we had to leave so early. Dad never explained, and I never asked. "There's one thing I need you to remember today, all right?" He spoke with a wad of chewing tobacco in his cheek. "What's that?" I asked. "When we've got the shot, we don't pause," he said. "Yeah, okay," I told him. Dad used to take Jason hunting every year. All I ever heard was how sharp Jason's aim was. Personally, I preferred gaming or horror flicks to sitting in the mud waiting to kill something. Still, Mom and I always cooked the post-hunt meal, ribeyes and baked potatoes, which earned me a few points with Dad. Once we got on the highway, Dad veered south toward Pittsburgh. That threw me off. I didn't know much about hunting, but I knew there were way more deer in the Alleghenies than around the city stadiums. "Do we need to stop and grab something?" I asked. Dad grabbed a crusty old Sheetz cup and spat into it. "Nope." Eventually, we pulled into Squirrel Hill, just outside downtown, a place full of big colonial homes and artsy movie theaters. Mom once took me there to see Booksmart because it wasn't playing in our usual cinema. We shared popcorn and Buncha Crunch, our shoulders bumping as we laughed. Dad hated neighborhoods like this, called them yuppie territory. A few more turns and we parked in a small lot next to a trailhead. Through the trees, I could see backyards of fancy houses. Ours was the only vehicle around. Without a word, Dad stepped out, went to the truck bed, and grabbed his rifle. I stayed inside, waiting. When it was time, he knocked on my window. I stepped out and followed him down the trail. "Bet you're enjoying how quiet the house is now," Dad said. I walked behind, dodging the branches and twigs he snapped underfoot. "Quiet," I repeated. "You're the kind of kid who stays indoors," he said. "And our house was always loud. I loved your mom, but man, she had a lot of opinions. Jason and I saw eye to eye mostly, but he was starting to grow into his own man." He chuckled and spat into the dirt again. The houses were getting closer. "I don't like the quiet," I said. Dad nodded and loaded a bullet into his rifle. I hadn't expected the neighborhood to be this close. When I pictured hunting, I imagined tree stands deep in the mountains, miles away from any people. Wouldn't folks get freaked out hearing gunfire out here? "I like quiet when I choose it," Dad said. "But we didn't choose our quiet, did we?" I said nothing. My mouth was full of blood from chewing the inside of my cheek. "I'm living in a silent house because of another man's mistake," he said. "You know how many times I had a buzz and wanted to drive home? But I didn't. I'm not rich. I can't pay $20 for a cab every time. But I did it anyway. I didn't want to be the reason some family didn't make it home." He came to a stop. "That one, for 111? He asked, pointing toward a house. I squinted at the mailbox through the trees. The numbers 411 were printed on the side. "Looks like it," I said. The place looked like something out of a Bond movie. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a wraparound deck, marble statues, even a backyard pool with a waterfall. Despite the early hour, a mom and her kid were already outside by the water. The boy, probably 4 or 5, held a remote in his hands as a little boat zipped in circles across the pool. Dad kneeled and took the scope out of his bag. He slid it onto the rifle. "You've learned about STDs, right?" he asked, whispering. He looked through the scope, adjusting it several times. His hands were trembling. "STDs," I repeated. "Diseases that spread from person to person," he said. "One night of fun and you wake up with your face all swollen. You know the kind." I nodded. I looked back toward the kid and the mom. She was crouching beside him, her hand gently on his shoulder. She was smiling like watching him steer that toy boat was the best thing she'd ever seen. She reminded me of Mom. "You really get what I'm saying?" Dad asked. Now he was flat on his belly in the mud. The rifle aimed straight at the luxury house. "Get what?" "How pain passes from person to person." He was growing impatient. "Yeah, I get it." "Why?" "Pain is just like a disease," he said. "It spreads. And if you've got a lot of it, you've got a responsibility not to give it to someone else." I could feel sweat building on my forehead. His tone. It was the same as the night he got the call about Mom and Jason. "Where are the actual hunting grounds?" I asked. Dad pulled the bolt on the rifle. "The guy who lives there gave us our pain," he said. I turned toward the house. Things started to click into place. "No, Dad," I said. "We need to leave. You know he walked out of the hospital after 2 hours?" "What?" "Your mom and Jason were still strapped in that car, cold and broken, and this guy's home hugging his wife. All he got were a couple bruises." Dad locked his eye to the scope. "It's time to share some of that pain," he muttered. I'd never stood up to Dad before. Our relationship wasn't great, but we had an understanding. Stay out of each other's way. But this wasn't something I could ignore. Dad inhaled slowly. As he let the breath out, I lunged forward and shoved the barrel of his rifle into the dirt. "Hey!" he shouted, shoving me back. "We need to go home," I said. "We don't have a home," he snapped. He rolled over and kicked me in the gut. The impact knocked the wind out of me and dropped me hard into the mud. "Please don't," I begged. I tried to crawl closer, but every movement sent a stabbing pain through my ribs. I could barely breathe, just short, shallow gasps, like some wounded animal. Dad didn't look back. His eyes stayed fixed on the mom and the boy. "For you, baby girl," he whispered. The shot rang out like thunder. I closed my eyes and buried my face in the mud. As the echo faded into the trees, I heard a splash. I looked up, slowly, blade by blade through the grass. The toy boat was still circling. The woman stood frozen, staring into the pool. Her expression didn't change at first. Then her mouth dropped open, puppet-like, and she screamed. A deep, gut-twisting howl. The water under the toy boat shifted from blue to a sickening red. Dad pulled his face away from the rifle and sobbed. Not the quiet, steely kind of tears he shed at the funeral. These were childlike, raw and ugly. Then, as if in a trance, he got to his feet, brushed the dirt off his clothes, and walked back toward the truck. I watched him go, slouched and slow. Every part of me wanted to chase him, to scream, to hit him for what he'd done. But I couldn't move. The mother's cries echoed through the woods. It felt like they were aimed right at me, like she was pleading with a god I could never be. I don't know if Dad's pain disappeared after that, but mine had only just begun.